The stars had always whispered of things greater than us. Even before Earth built her first crude orbital station, we looked up with wonder and fear, guessing what might be waiting out there. Some imagined beauty. Others imagined monsters. But no one, ever imagined them. We didn't even know they were coming. Not at first. The first sign wasn't a fleet in the sky. It wasn't a message or warning. It was silence. A deep space listening post on the edge of the Kuiper Belt went dark. Then another. Then a science vessel near Neptune's moon Triton just stopped transmitting. No explosion. No mayday. Just gone. People on Earth didn't panic right away. Accidents happen in space all the time. The news talked about solar flares, faulty systems, or a rogue asteroid. But the ones who worked in the black, pilots, engineers, those who watched the stars for a living, they knew something was wrong. A message finally came through. Not from the missing ships. From something else. It wasn't in any known language. It wasn't even directed at us. It was like someone was talking to themselves. Observing. Calculating. Cold. Scientific. The kind of tone used when cataloging bugs under a microscope. They didn't even bother to hide it. The few linguists who got their hands on it deciphered parts of the broadcast. It was a log. A fleet log. Confirmed, sentient bipedal mammals, system origin, soul. Designation, primitive. Temperament, reactive. Estimated time to planetary subjugation, 12 standard cycles. It was the way they said primitive. Like we were an inconvenience. Like we were dust on the edge of their boot. The broadcast ended with 2 words that chilled every human who read them. Begin cleanse. No declaration of war. No contact. No reason. Just extermination. By the time Earth's defense grid detected them, the fleet was already inside Jupiter's orbit. Hundreds of ships. Shapes that didn't belong in our physics. Materials we couldn't scan. They didn't cloak themselves. They didn't need to. It was like a cat walking into a room full of mice. They thought it was over before it began. But they didn't understand what they were walking into. Earth didn't have a grand united defense force. Not really. The Planetary Council was still arguing about sovereignty and economic zones when the first wave of data came in. But in the chaos, some people didn't wait for orders. Veterans, miners, scientists, retired engineers. People with enough fight left in them to say, not like this. A call went out. Unofficial. Underground. If the governments wouldn't act, the people would. One of those people was a woman who worked in a scrapyard outside Johannesburg. She'd once been an aerospace engineer during the Mars terraforming project, before budget cuts and corporate infighting buried her dreams. But in the noise of fear, her hands remembered the feel of alloy and thrust vectors. She rebuilt an old shuttle into something lethal. Crude. Ugly. But fast. Another was a boy on a remote Alaskan research station, just 17, who figured out how to hijack the alien signal pulses and map their fleet trajectories. No military background. Just obsession, a sharp mind, and desperation. Then there was the old man on the moon base who never spoke much, who always walked with a limp. When they came, he opened a crate no one knew existed. Inside was something illegal. A prototype railgun that could pierce armor at half the speed of light. The last relic of a war the public forgot. And there were others. So many others. Not heroes. Not soldiers. Just people. They called it the Midnight Push. Thousands of human-made vessels, many of them cobbled together from freighters, harvesters, or museum ships, flew out to meet a force they didn't understand. It should have been suicide. But the first shot wasn't ours. It was theirs. A beam of energy that sliced through a converted cargo ship like butter. 8 lives gone in an instant. Just gone. That was when humanity understood. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't diplomacy. This was extinction. And we answered. A modified or drill pierced the hull of one of their smaller scouts. The explosion was local, but the message wasn't. We weren't just going to lay down and die. They didn't flinch. They didn't respond. They simply advanced. And yet, despite their superiority, despite their arrogance, they hadn't accounted for something very simple. Humans are irrational. We do things that don't make sense. We fight when we should run. We laugh in the face of death. We sacrifice everything for a chance, even a slim one. That kind of madness wasn't in their calculations. It never is. In the hours that followed, the solar system became a graveyard. Not for us. For them. They lost ships. Not many. But more than they expected. For every 100 they destroyed, we took down 1. And each one cost them more than they realized. Because humans learned fast. We adapted. And we didn't forget. A captured transmission from one of their damaged vessels, half decoded by a team of teenagers in New Delhi, confirmed what many had started to suspect. Subject species displays unpredictable combat patterns. Collateral self-damage acceptable to achieve offensive outcomes. Recommend reassessment of projection models. Threat level escalated. We were no longer primitive. We were a threat. And they had made a mistake. Because the moment you give humanity a reason to fight, not for power, not for territory, but for survival, we don't stop. We don't break. We multiply. They tried to understand us. Sent probes. Interrogated survivors. Studied behavior. But the more they studied, the more their confusion grew. Why would a mother throw herself in front of a weapon to protect a stranger's child? Why would a pilot deliberately ram their ship into a battleship core, knowing it would kill them just to take one more down? Why would a people with so little hope still fight like they could win? They thought it was madness, weakness, but it was something else. It was being human. A small fleet of survivors regrouped near Saturn. Scattered, bleeding but alive. Among them was a girl with burned scars along her arm who had once been a violinist. She hadn't fired a weapon in her life before the invasion. Now she led tactical formations that had downed 2 enemy vessels. Not because she was trained, but because she saw patterns in the chaos. She moved like she was writing music in space. One of her reports reached the last functioning military command bunker on Earth. It was read by a man who once hated space. He'd lost his wife to a malfunctioning colony shuttle. He used to say humanity should never have left Earth. Now he was the one coordinating strikes from orbit, speaking to every militia, every stray fighter still out there. His voice, steady, low, became something people followed. Not because he was charismatic, but because he believed. He believed we still had a chance. And then, the warning. A new fleet arrived. Bigger. Colder. The first one wasn't even a real force. Just a scout legion. The real empire was coming now. The message this time was deliberate. It came in every human language at once. Submission will be accepted. Resistance will result in system-wide purge. Final decision required within 1 planetary rotation. We were offered a choice, but we already knew the answer. The message was played across every surviving channel. In the silence after it ended, a voice broke through. Not a leader. Not a general. A child. He asked one simple question. If we say no, will they leave us alone? The silence that followed was heavy. And then someone answered. No. They'll kill us anyway. And so, the people of Earth gave their answer. Not in words. In action. Old shipyards roared back to life. Factories that had once made toys or tools now churned out weapons. Code junkies reprogrammed stolen alien tech. Biologists created countermeasures from harvested enemy flesh. Mechanics slept 3 hours a day, covered in grease, welding ship armor with bare hands. And the musicians played. Not to entertain but to remind everyone what we were fighting for. Not power. Not revenge. But a chance to still hear a song tomorrow. On the day of the final fleet's arrival, the skies burned red. Our last line of defense wasn't a grand superweapon. It wasn't a miracle. It was a line of ships held together by grit, gum, and desperation. Some had names scrawled in paint, Last Laugh, Rust Angel, Freeborn. Others just bore the names of lost loved ones. Each one carried people who knew they might not return. But they launched anyway. As the alien fleet advanced, ready to extinguish the last spark of Earth, one final transmission was sent. Short. Clear. You were warned. And with that, the stars erupted in fire. The stars erupted in fire, but Earth didn't blink. The silence that followed the first impact was thicker than the void itself. It wasn't just quiet, it was the kind of silence that made hearts stop. People stood still in bunkers, on rooftops, inside hollowed-out transport ships, watching the sky as if it might crack open. And in a way it had. The first blast had been human-made, an antimatter mine left floating in what used to be a debris belt. One of the Empire's larger carriers had rolled right into it. No shields, no evasive maneuver. They hadn't expected anything from primitives. But we'd learned. We'd adapted. And now we knew where to hurt them. On the outskirts of Mars, in an old research facility buried under a mountain of iron dust, a woman leaned over a control console, shaking. Not from fear. From exhaustion. She had been awake for 3 days. Her name wasn't known to the fighters above. But the virus code she'd written, the thing now running like a ghost inside the Empire's internal systems, was hers. It didn't bring them down. It didn't even slow their main fleet. But it gave them just enough hiccups, enough flickers in their sensor arrays, to make them hesitate. And in war, Even a second's hesitation can be deadly. She leaned back in her chair, eyes bloodshot, listening to the distant rumble as her planet burned. Her work was done. But there was no relief. Only dread. Because this was far from over. In the orbit of Earth, human ships darted like insects in a hurricane. Their movements were unpredictable, almost chaotic. No formation. No central fleet strategy. Just chaos. But it worked. Because the Empire relied on patterns. On logic. And humans were anything but logical. One ship, a refitted mining freighter, drifted silently between the dark sides of two moons. Its surface had been blackened to reduce its heat signature. Inside, its pilot watched a screen that flickered with alien data. He didn't understand most of it. Just one symbol, a pulsing red triangle. Enemy nearby. He adjusted his course, breathing slow. Not out of calm, but because he knew the oxygen recycler had started to fail. He had maybe 6 hours left before the air turned thin. But he didn't care. His mission wasn't to live. It was to hit that alien capital ship with the warhead strapped to his back hull. One hit. That's all they needed. He reached forward and placed a photo on the dash. 3 faces, all smiling. Gone now. That was why he flew. Down on Earth, not far from what used to be the Mediterranean coast, a group of civilians huddled in an underground shelter. They could feel the tremors above, hear the distant rumble of skyships clashing in low orbit. There was no internet. No updates. Only static on the radio. A young girl, maybe 8, sat clutching a tattered plush bear. Her eyes were wide but dry. She didn't cry. Not anymore. Beside her, an old man stared at the ceiling as if he could see through it. They thought we'd kneel, he whispered, voice raspy. But we don't know how. Someone nearby asked, do we even have a chance? No one answered. But the silence didn't feel like surrender. It felt like waiting. Waiting to see if the impossible could still happen. In the darkness beyond Neptune, far from the main battle, a small stealth vessel floated cold and lifeless. It was invisible to most scans. Inside, a single woman monitored what might have been the key to everything. She was part of a secret program called Echo Black, a listening team tasked with understanding the enemy before the war had even begun. Back then they were laughed at. Paranoid, some had said. Waste of resources. But now she was one of the few who knew what the Empire really was. Not a nation. Not even a species. Was a machine. Not entirely artificial, but not entirely alive either. A fusion of countless species, absorbed and stripped of their identity. The Empire didn't conquer out of greed. It absorbed out of principle. They saw individuality as a flaw. Emotion as disorder. Free will as weakness. To them, humanity wasn't dangerous because of our technology. It was because we refused to be absorbed. And somewhere deep in their collective programming, that made us terrifying. She sat alone in her pod, fingers tapping through waveforms and interference patterns. She was searching, not for their ships but for their minds. Somewhere in the static she believed there was a flaw. A ripple. Something not perfectly calculated. And if she found it, it might be the only way to tear them apart from within. Back on Earth, in a hidden shelter inside the ruins of what used to be Berlin, a boy no older than 16 sat at a console surrounded by scavenged tech. He had built a communication bridge between the fractured human networks. Nothing official. Just a relay system made of desperation and rusted wires. But through his hands, fighters could talk again. Not all of them. Not clearly. But enough. Through him, warnings were passed. Plans were made. Lives were saved. And he never once left his chair. He wore headphones too big for his head, voice crackling with static as he shouted across channels. Ghost fire to Nova team, you've got a cruiser coming from Vector 70, get out. And somehow, they did. No training. No uniform. Just a kid who refused to let the lines go silent. On Luna Base, a once-abandoned research facility now turned command post, a council had formed, not of politicians but survivors. One was a mechanic who'd once built racing pods for fun. Another was a biologist who discovered how to disrupt the Empire's drones using frequency pulses. The last was an ex-con sentenced for smuggling reactor cores. They didn't vote. They didn't argue over titles. They simply worked, side by side, feeding information into the last functioning defense AI. Ironically, a machine made to calculate human unpredictability. But the AI didn't lead. It only listened. Because in this war, the leaders were the ones who stayed when everyone else ran. And then, something changed. The Empire slowed. Not entirely. Not everywhere. But in places. Scouts stopped moving. Beams stopped firing. A moment of hesitation like a glitch. On one human warship, barely holding together, an engineer spotted the delay. "They're sinking slower," she whispered, her voice trembling. Her captain leaned in. "Say again?" She pointed at the readings. "Their fleet. It's not responding as fast as before. Almost like they're arguing." It didn't make sense. The Empire didn't argue. It functioned. Unless something had gone wrong. Back in deep space, Echo Black's operative watched as a signal repeated, fractured across different bands. Not human. Not even Empire standard. Was a question. Not in words, but in data. A repeating inquiry over and over again. Why do they resist? It wasn't strategy. It wasn't calculation. It was doubt. She leaned forward, heart racing. Somewhere inside the Empire's collective, a spark had ignited. One thought out of sync. That was it. The flaw. The tiniest crack. She immediately started composing a response. Not technical. Not a virus. A message. Something raw. Something human. She typed slowly. "Because we remember." And sent it into the dark. She didn't know if it would be received. Or even understood. But sometimes all it takes is one voice in the dark. Meanwhile, Earth was still bleeding. Cities turned to ash. Skies choked with smoke. But the people remained. In hidden shelters they told stories. In broken ships they played music. Even in the ashes of destroyed towns they planted seeds. The Empire couldn't understand that. How could you fight a people who grew flowers in rubble? On the edge of the battlefield, an alien dreadnought hovered above Earth's atmosphere. Inside, countless minds worked as one. But somewhere something stirred. Pause. A question. What? Why do they continue? And in that hesitation, somewhere between calculation and purpose, the ghost of doubt began to whisper. The next wave of attacks didn't come as fast. Some ships drifted longer than usual. Some drones turned without firing. Humans noticed. But we didn't stop. We couldn't. Because we knew what would happen if we gave them time to think again. One fighter pilot, a woman who had lost both legs in an earlier strike, now flew using a neural interface built by her brother. Her ship wasn't fast. But it was agile. She had memorized the patterns. She knew the moment of hesitation. And she flew straight into the heart of the formation, leaving behind a trail of drones designed to mimic engine signatures. 3 of their ships followed her. None returned. She didn't either. But her last message was clear. Their patterns are breaking. Keep pushing. In the halls of an abandoned Earth museum, a small group of children found shelter. An old janitor protected them. Every night, he lit a candle and told stories, not of war but of life. Of the oceans. Of the wind. Of laughter. He wanted them to remember what it meant to be human. Because if they survived, they would need to rebuild. Not just cities. But meaning. In space, a second message came from the Empire. This time it wasn't a threat. It was different. A single word broadcast across every known human frequency. Confused. Humanity didn't know whether it was a trick or the beginning of something new. But it didn't matter. Because we weren't going to wait for an answer. We would fight until the sky went dark. And even then, we would fight in the shadows. They should have run when we warned them. But they didn't. And now they were learning. We weren't just a species. We were a storm. And the storm had only just begun. The sky didn't sleep anymore. Every night, flashes of light painted the clouds, silent bursts of color that came from too far away to make sound but close enough to feel. People had stopped asking what each explosion meant. They didn't want to know whether it was one of ours or one of theirs. It was easier to just wait. But hope doesn't die easy. Even now. Somewhere over the Pacific, a sea station that had been a research lab now floated half-sunk, patched together with hull panels scavenged from wrecked escape pods. Inside, 2 women worked by candlelight. They had once studied whales. Now they were mapping movements of alien destroyers through ocean current distortions. And they found something. A heat signature. Massive. Lurking in the deep trenches of Earth's oceans. Too deep for human eyes, too quiet for sonar. But it was there. The Empire had sent something under the sea. They weren't just coming from above. They were surrounding us. A message went out, buried in tight beam transmissions only a few could catch. Unknown structure rising from Mariana Trench. Size estimate, city. Composition, unknown. Back on Luna, the Council didn't know what to make of it. Some thought it was a second front. Others thought it was a final weapon. But no one could explain why the Empire would plant something so massive below the surface without destroying everything above. Unless, they weren't just here to kill. They were here to overwrite. to replace what we were, to plant their order where our chaos used to live. That changed everything. And yet, the fighting above never stopped. Earth's orbital layer was littered with wreckage. Debris fields as wide as continents. Some of them were pieces of alien ships. Some were ours. No one counted anymore. A pilot drifted alone in one of those fields, engine dead, lights off. He'd been hiding for hours, hoping to catch just one clear shot at a dreadnought moving overhead. His suit's oxygen level blinked yellow. No backup. But he didn't panic. Instead, he closed his eyes and whispered a promise to someone who wasn't there anymore. He waited. He watched. And when the massive shadow passed above him, his finger hovered over a single trigger. He fired. One blast. One hit. Straight into the underbelly of the ship. It wasn't enough to destroy it. Not even close. But it made the Empire pause again. They hadn't expected such defiance from someone who was already dying. They hadn't expected humanity to keep fighting even when the fight was already lost. And that terrified them more than any weapon. Somewhere deep inside their chain of command, or whatever passed for command in their collective, a schism began to form. The messages started to change. They no longer spoke of extermination. Now they spoke of compliance deviation. Increased host unpredictability. Tactical reassessment. To the Empire, those were red flags. Warnings that the system itself was beginning to fail. And failure was not an option. So they pushed harder. More ships. Heavier strikes. Planetary disruptors positioned above major tectonic zones, preparing to crack Earth open if necessary. The countdown had begun. We had hours. Maybe less. But we weren't finished yet. On the outskirts of the asteroid belt, a ship unlike any other powered up for the first time. It had no name. It was built in silence, piece by piece, from every corner of the solar system. Abandoned freighters, broken station cores, even parts of ancient satellites. It was massive, ugly, and entirely human. Inside, engineers wept as it came online. Not because they were scared, but because they never thought it would work. The ship carried no crew. Just an AI. One that had been trained on every emotion a human had ever recorded. Its orders were simple. Delay them. As long as you can. It jumped forward into the thick of the Empire's inner formation, broadcasting one final message as it went. We are still here. The Empire responded with fire. But the delay bought time. Just enough. Back on Earth, the trench anomaly had begun to rise. Not all at once. Slowly. Like something waking up. Buildings, if you could call them that, began to surface. Towers made of bone-like material, smooth and black, humming with low frequencies that vibrated through the water and the air. It wasn't a weapon. It was a structure. A seed. They were planting something beneath us. And whatever it wasn't meant to leave. The girl in the underwater lab watched in horror as data streamed in. It was reshaping the ocean floor. Heating currents. Spreading nanostructures. Converting the Earth itself into something else. Not destroying. Replacing. They weren't trying to burn us away. They were trying to override us entirely. In the last functioning university data archive near Norway, a young woman screamed when she saw the patterns. She wasn't a soldier. Just a student. But she understood fractals. And what she saw in the deep-sea scans was clear. The pattern wasn't natural. It wasn't alien either. It was a reflection of our own DNA. Twisted. Rewritten. Controlled. The Empire wasn't just rewriting our planet. They were rewriting us. She uploaded her findings to every open channel she could reach. The message was simple. They're trying to turn Earth into a colony for something else. Not for them. For what comes after us. Panic wasn't the right word for what followed. There was no time for it. There was only resolve. From the dark side of the moon, to the broken cities of Earth, to the children hiding in underground schools, all of humanity began to understand one thing. This wasn't just a war for survival. It was a war for existence. And it was reaching the breaking point. All over the planet, strange frequencies began to pulse. Some humans collapsed, bleeding from the ears. Others heard voices. Not in language. In emotion. A dull hum of surrender. A pressure to give in. A desire to stop fighting. But something pushed back. From deep within our minds. Our memories. Our losses. The sound of laughter. The warmth of sunlight. The feel of a hand held in the dark. The things they couldn't replicate. We clung to them. Art. Even as everything else fell apart. Above, in orbit, the last human fleet regrouped. It wasn't much. Maybe a dozen ships. Some of them damaged. Some running low on fuel. But they had a plan. They'd mapped the central ship, the core of the Empire's fleet presence in our system. They didn't know if it was a brain, a hub, or a beacon. But if they could take it down, just maybe they could give Earth a chance. The plan required perfect timing, sacrifice, and maybe a miracle. No one volunteered. Because no one had to. Everyone was already in. Below, on Earth, the ocean structure reached its final stage. It began to glow, pulsing, breathing, and the ground trembled. All across the globe, every screen, every device, every implant, one message appeared. Final phase initiated. And yet, in a dusty basement in Morocco, a man who used to fix old radios connected two ancient generators and hijacked the signal. He broadcast a different message. Just one sentence. One voice. A child's. We are not finished. The signal spread. Through broken satellites. Through dying ships. Through shattered data lines. And something changed. For just a moment, one of the enemy's ships slowed, turned, and didn't fire. The humans didn't cheer. They didn't even breathe. Because they knew this was the moment before the storm breaks. The final breath before everything either falls apart or breaks through. In the silence that followed, something new happened. The enemy responded. Not with weapons, but with a question. One word. Not in their tongue. In ours. Why? And from across the planet, across space, across every voice that could still speak, humanity answered. In thousands of voices. In screams. In tears. In music. In static. Because we are human. And then, everything went white. Everything went white. No sound, no movement. Just blinding light, as if the entire sky had been peeled back and replaced with silence. For a heartbeat, maybe two, there was nothing. No pain. No fear. No war. Then the light began to fade. And the world wasn't the same. The ocean stopped moving. The clouds above Earth's atmosphere hovered motionless, frozen in strange patterns. Satellites hung dead in orbit, their signals gone. The pulse from the alien structure in the Mariana Trench had stopped, but not because it had failed. It had finished. What rose from that deep, black water wasn't a ship. Was a shape. A tower so tall it pierced the edge of the atmosphere, blacker than space, bending light like it didn't belong in this universe. Its surface pulsed with something alive, something ancient. And beneath it the ocean boiled. At first humanity didn't know what it meant. Until people started changing. Not everyone. Just a few. They woke up screaming. Their veins glowed faint blue. Their eyes dilated. Some collapsed and didn't wake up. Others stood, trembling, and started whispering in a voice that wasn't theirs. Words from another language. Not the Empire's. Something older. Something that hadn't spoken in a long, long time. In one bunker near the ruins of Cairo, a young boy began drawing strange symbols in the dirt over and over. He didn't speak. Didn't eat. Just drew. A repeating spiral that none of Earth's historians could identify. Except one. In an ancient digital archive stored deep beneath the Vatican ruins, a linguistic AI flagged the symbols. They matched cave paintings from thousands of years ago. Symbols found on opposite sides of the planet from cultures that never met. And buried in those ancient symbols was a story. A warning. Earth had been visited before. Long before humanity built cities. Before it even had words. The visitors came not to destroy but to test. To plant seeds. To see if the world could be made ready. And then, they left. But the seed never died. The tower rising from the sea wasn't an invasion device. It was an awakening beacon. A signal. Calling something else. Something even the Empire feared. The war we thought we were fighting, humans versus Empire, was only the surface. We were on a clock. And it had just hit zero. The Empire's ships, which had begun to hesitate, now surged forward with terrifying speed. No more delays. No more hesitation. Whatever was coming, they didn't want it here. Their weapons shifted. Bigger. Cruder. Less controlled. They were no longer aiming to subjugate Earth. They were trying to erase it. From orbit, from space, from every record they had. It was an extinction strike. And we were in the middle. On the ground, humans scrambled to move. To hide. But there was nowhere left untouched. The air shimmered with heat and energy. Whole mountain ranges began to hum with low vibrations. And through it all, a new sound emerged. Voices. Not the Empire. Not human. Something else. The whispers came from the tower, carried through the water, through the earth, through the sky. They weren't speaking to the Empire. They were speaking to us. Testing us. Seeing if we were ready. Somewhere near Alaska, in a cold metal shack powered by backup batteries, A woman curled in the corner began speaking in sync with the whispering voice. She didn't know the language, but it flowed from her mouth anyway. And as she spoke, her pulse slowed. Her body calmed. Then she screamed. And everything inside the shack exploded in blue light. A week before, she'd been a factory worker. Now she was something else. Or part of something else. She didn't survive the transformation. But her body left behind something new. Crystals. Charcoal. Emitting low hums. The scientists who found them were terrified to touch them. The soldiers weren't. One of them picked up a fragment and held it near his weapon. It bonded instantly. Changed the structure. The next time he fired, the shot sliced clean through two enemy drones like they were paper. Humanity had just been handed a key. Not to victory. To evolution. But at what cost? Up in orbit, the last human fleet received scattered reports. The tower was no longer just sending signals. It was drawing power. Pulling heat from the core of the planet. Siphoning energy from the moon. Even the sun dimmed, ever so slightly. And something began to move beneath the surface of the tower. A shape. A form. The Empire's lead ship broadcast an emergency call across all known frequencies, not to threaten, but to beg. They were not here to destroy us. They were trying to prevent something worse. And it was too late. From deep within the tower, a shape began to rise. Not a being. Not exactly. More like a presence. A force that pressed against the air, against the thoughts of every living mind on Earth. People dropped to their knees, gasping as pressure pushed against their skulls like water pressing in from all sides. It didn't kill. Just looked. Looked at everything we were. Everything we had been. Our wars. Our love. Our cruelty. Our joy. It didn't judge. It simply watched. And that was worse. Because it meant we were being measured. The Empire had failed to stop it. And now we had to answer for ourselves. The whispers grew louder. They weren't just testing. They were choosing. In the burning skies above, human ships kept fighting. Not out of strategy anymore. But because it was all we had left. The Empire didn't respond in kind. They stopped firing. They began to retreat. Thousands of ships. Vanishing. Running. The same Empire that once marched through galaxies now fled like prey. Because whatever had awakened beneath our oceans wasn't interested in conquest. It was older than empires. And Earth was just its cradle. But not its only one. Humanity stood on the edge of something impossible. On one side, annihilation. On the other, transformation. Neither felt like victory. And deep inside the tower, something moved again. A flicker. Like an eye opening. The second presence. Not the one watching. The one waiting. And the whispers finally gave way to a single word. Spoken in every voice. Every language. Every mind. Choose. And then the sky shattered. Not from impact. From sound. A roar that wasn't heard through ears but through blood, bones, memory. A scream of something that had waited too long, buried too deep. It didn't want to test. It wanted out. And the final countdown had begun. Humanity had minutes, maybe less, to decide what it was going to be. Because the storm wasn't over. It was just getting started. The sky shattered with a sound no one could explain. Buildings trembled. Orbit cracked. Even the moon seemed to groan under the weight of something pressing through the atmosphere. Not a ship, not a being, but a pressure that made hearts stop and memories rise to the surface like bubbles in boiling water. People dropped to the ground across continents, not from pain but from something deeper. Recognition. Fear. And above it all, the tower at the heart of the ocean pulsed like a living heart. The Empire was gone. Fled. In silence. No threats. No last attack. Just vanishing trails of gravity ruptures as their ships disappeared beyond the edge of the solar system. It was never about humanity. Not really. They had been trying to stop the awakening. And failed. So now it was on us. Earth had become the epicenter of something older than the stars. And it was awake. In one of the last surviving orbital command ships, a man stood alone, watching Earth spin beneath him. His face was bruised, hands shaking from hours of coordinating battles that never stopped. He wasn't a soldier. Just a systems analyst from a city that didn't exist anymore. But now, somehow, he was the voice others followed. He didn't speak into the comms. Not yet. He watched as the planet began to glow from its core, light bleeding through tectonic scars, oceans turning mirror flat. The tower no longer pulsed. It breathed. And with every breath, reality felt thinner. One of the engineers stumbled into the room. We've got movement again. Something's happening inside it. He nodded, though his voice didn't come right away. We're past warnings. In a cave in Chile, A child with glowing eyes sat cross-legged, muttering the same word over and over. Choose. 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 It wasn't a command. It was a plea. All over the world, humans who had never met shared dreams. Visions. Of hands reaching through light. Of a sky turning to glass. Of a choice none of them understood. The presence inside the tower wasn't speaking with logic or language. It was connecting. Showing everyone what it had seen in us. Our wars. Our kindness. Our fear. Our love. It didn't want to destroy. It didn't want to save. It wanted us to decide. And deep in the Mariana Trench, something began to rise again. Not another structure. A shape. A silhouette as wide as a continent, pushing upward from beneath the seabed, wrapped in living metal and ancient stone, its surface etched with the same spiral symbols seen in those long-forgotten caves. The real seed. Not a tower. A vessel. A gate. And it was opening. Somewhere in Iceland, a group of refugees watched as the northern lights turned red. Not from heat. From memory. People began seeing faces in the sky, familiar ones. Lost ones. Parents. Children. Friends long gone. It was an illusion. It was the gate searching through humanity's collective past. Looking for anchors. For truth. And in that moment the final message was made clear. Humanity had been chosen not for its strength or science or defiance, but for its potential. The gate wasn't opening to let something in. It was opening to let something out. Something buried in the DNA of our kind. A fragment. A shard. Of them. From long before we had names. A gift. Or a test. No one could tell anymore. And the countdown was almost over. Inside the orbiting ship, the man at the console finally opened a channel to Earth. His voice was calm. Honest. This isn't just about survival anymore. This isn't about the Empire. Or war. This is about what we choose to become. We have one shot. No second chance. Across the system humans responded. In whispers. In code. In tears. Yes, they were ready. And Earth answered. The tower cracked open. Not from damage. From transformation. It turned to light. Thousands of streams, bursting into the sky, wrapping around the planet like threads of starlight. The oceans surged. The air thickened with energy. Every living thing felt the shift. It wasn't pain. It was rebirth. And in that final second, just before the light consumed everything, the twist came. From the darkness between the planets, a new signal broke through. Not the Empire. Not the presence. Something else. Cold. Mechanical. Older. A failed experiment. Another seed. From another world. And it had seen what we'd become. It didn't want to join. It wanted to end it. Across the black, hundreds of dormant structures began to stir. And humanity, still changing, still awakening, suddenly wasn't alone in the storm. The gate hadn't just connected us to our future. It had awakened our past. And our past was coming. Fast. The screen went dark. And Earth held its breath. The blackness between the stars came alive. Hundreds of signals. Thousands. Buried in the farthest corners of the system, silent for millennia. They stirred now, waking like echoes of a forgotten age. Cold, exact, and without hesitation. Another seed. A different one. Not like the tower. Not like us. This one hadn't come to test or guide. It had come to correct. Its purpose wasn't growth. It was containment. The message from this second force came through every device, every screen, every thought. Contain the divergence. Stabilize the anomaly. Reset the system. And we were the anomaly. The light from the gate hadn't even settled yet. Earth was still trembling, suspended between everything it had been and everything it might become. People were still seeing visions. Memories that weren't theirs. Emotions they couldn't name. They were still changing, physically, mentally, spiritually. And now they were being targeted for deletion. In the control chamber of the last human fleet ship, the man who had once been just a systems analyst leaned forward, eyes locked on the incoming data. The fleet's limited sensors confirmed it. Multiple vessels were approaching at impossible speeds. Not biological. Not Empire class. Not of this universe. These things were pure code turned into mass. They didn't fly with engines. They bent space like it was fabric. No heat. No sound. No intent but correction. The gate had unlocked something inside us. This new enemy had come to lock it again. Back on Earth, the transformation was reaching its peak. The tower had fully dissolved into light, and from its core emerged something indescribable, part structure, part living memory. It stood taller than mountains, but it wasn't a weapon. It was a signal made real. All over the world, people began rising to their feet, those who had been touched by the transformation. They weren't glowing or flying or shooting beams. They looked normal. But something behind their eyes had shifted. They weren't other. They were more themselves than ever before. They were what humanity had always been becoming. One of them was the young girl who had been sketching spirals in the bunker. She stepped out into the open, her hands trembling not from fear, but from the weight of everything she now felt inside her. Her parents watched in silence, unsure of what to say, unsure of who she even was anymore. "I remember everything," she said quietly. The boy in the refugee camp who had seen faces in the sky? He was now helping coordinate defense posts, not with rank or command, but with a strange calm clarity. He spoke of patterns he could see in the stars, in the movements of the enemy ships. He called them loops, repeating signals from the first seed. "They're not here to destroy us," he said. "They're here to lock us into what we were before. They think this change is a virus." "But we're not infected," someone said. "No," he whispered. "We're evolving." It became clear, the final battle wasn't between humans and aliens. It was between what we had been, and what we were becoming. The enemy from the void didn't care about our stories, our pain, our hope. It only wanted to reset the system. But we had never followed systems well. And we weren't about to start now. The last surviving shipyard, hidden in the shadows of Saturn, activated its emergency core. It had been built in secret, designed to turn raw materials into one last weapon. Not a bomb. A carrier. One designed to carry memory, not missiles. A ship made from thought. A human mind had to fly it. But not a normal one. Someone who had changed. Someone new. In a small lab near the Arctic Circle, the woman who had written the first virus against the Empire sat alone, the light from the gate shining in her pupils. She had been silent for hours, her body still, her mind elsewhere. Her team thought she was dying. But she was becoming something else. She stood up, placed a hand on the console and whispered, "I'll fly it." Her mind had touched something inside the light. She wasn't superhuman. But she understood. Not just code. Not just logic. The feeling behind it. And that's what the enemy could never grasp. They had power, speed, knowledge. But they didn't have feeling. They didn't have us. So she climbed aboard the memory ship, now fully grown from layers of organic light and quantum metal. It didn't have buttons. It responded to thought. And when she stepped inside, it recognized her. All over Earth, people looked up as the new threat arrived. Smooth black ships that didn't shine, didn't roar, didn't threaten. They simply erased. Anything they touched vanished. Cities, satellites, oceans. No wreckage. No sound. Just gone. But then the memory ship rose. And it sang. Not in words. Not in sound. In stories. All the stories of Earth. Of loss. Of beauty. Of failure and forgiveness. Every human emotion. Every fragile, imperfect moment. The memory ship projected it through space. And the void ships paused. For the first time, they hesitated. The light inside them flickered. Because they didn't understand. They couldn't. They were programmed to respond to threat. But this wasn't threat. This was truth. The woman inside the ship reached out, mind to mind. Not fighting. Not pleading. Just showing. She sent them a memory of her child's laughter. A sunrise over ruins. A love that didn't last but still mattered. The void ships shuddered. They began to fragment, not explode. Split apart not from force, but from contradiction. Their code couldn't accept the existence of a species that chose chaos, grief, joy, heartbreak, and called it life. In the last moment before they dissolved, one of the void ships sent a signal. Unstable system. Self-termination recommended. Core anomaly cannot be corrected. Escape impossible. And then, silence. The last of them vanished. Earth exhaled. Above, the gate slowly folded back into the sky. Not shut. Open. Always open now. The girl in the bunker looked up at the stars and didn't feel small anymore. She felt part of them. The man in orbit returned to Earth, stepped onto scorched ground and fell to his knees, not from pain. From peace. He'd lived through it. All of it. And now, maybe, just maybe, they could begin again. Rebuilt. Not the same as before. Not cities filled with glass towers and forgotten people. But something real. A civilization that remembered what it nearly became, and what it chose instead. A world born from fire and fear and the choice to feel everything instead of nothing. In time the gate stopped glowing. The ocean calmed. The stars returned to their quiet drift. And humanity? We stepped into a future that wasn't written for us. We wrote it ourselves. No empire. No programming. No reset. Just hearts. And hands. And stories. And somewhere, in the deepest part of space, where no light had touched for a billion years, something watched us. Not in fear. Not in judgment. Just curiosity. Because for the first time, something had emerged from the trial with its soul intact. Something that chose to feel. To love. To hope. That something was called human. And we weren't done yet. Not even close. If this story moved you, surprised you, or made you think, please give it a like and share it with someone who loves powerful sci-fi. Every view, every share helps us bring more human-centered stories to life. Let us know in the comments what kind of tale you'd like to hear next. This is HFY Fiction, and your support means everything.